Okay, I'm gonna be honest, whenever I started writing this video, I struggled on whether to call it top 5 things people do wrong whenever they mix their productions or whatever I put in the YouTube title, and also top 5 ways to improve. I think I went with the more cynical one because people click that more, but they're the same. And also keep in mind, if you do these things, don't feel bad. Don't feel like you're being called out. I mean, I only wrote these down because I did all these things. I still sometimes continue to do these things, and I have to rein myself in and control myself because not all this stuff is super intuitive. So please, don't feel bad. Don't feel like you've done anything wrong. We are all just learning. Number 1, reverb on everything. And when I say that, I mean literally putting reverb on the channel itself rather than using an auxiliary send or a return track. They're called different things depending on whatever software you're working on. But essentially, a lot of people like to put that reverb directly on the channel itself, and then they take that dry wet knob and they just dial it back. So what you're doing whenever you're doing that, and I've mentioned this in my mixing vocals video, you're actually taking the original signal and then you are chopping it away. Like for example, if I have 50% wet, I've taken 50% of the original signal, chopped it down so half of it's reverb, and I'm left with half the signal I started with. Just within the nature of reverb, that 50% that you just gave to the reverb is going to be a lot muddier because reverb has a lot of low-end mids into it. So if you do this on all of your track, you're going to be left with a really muddy, watery mix that isn't super clear because you've given a ton of that original signal to your reverb. So the solution to this is to just create an aux track or a return track, put the reverb on there, and then figure out on your specific software or your DAW where to send that original signal to it. If you're using Ableton, it's as simple as just taking the A or B knob on the slider itself, turn up the knob to the corresponding return track in the software. So this one is still an issue for me, and I would assume it's still an issue for a ton of people more experienced than me. Compression on everything. We tend to think in general the 2 things you should always put on a track are an EQ and a reverb. Hey, what's up? This is me from the future. I meant to say compressor. We tend to put an EQ and a compressor on everything, not reverb. Although I do realize that my first point was we also put reverb on everything, but I meant to say compressor. Okay, bye. And while I can get behind the EQ argument, although there are things that don't even need an EQ if they're properly recorded, you shouldn't put a compressor on everything. Here's the reason why. Because compression brings out the detail and the quieter parts of an audio signal, and it also brings down the peak, i.e. squashing them together, you're going to be left with a lot of detail and not a lot of dynamic range. So what happens when you use that on everything? Well, you're going to bring out detail on everything and lose your dynamic range, which leads to everything sounding blown out. It's a really good way to bring out a really 2-dimensional mix, i.e. there is not a lot of dynamic interest in your sound, and because you brought out the detail in everything through compression, you've essentially brought out the detail in nothing. Here are some things that, depending on the situation, you don't need to compress. Distorted guitar. Distorted electric guitars are already compressed by nature. My light went out. So yes, distorted guitars are already compressed by nature. That's the way distortion works. It's clipping. It's artificial clipping. Or not really artificial, it's purposeful clipping. Another thing you might not want to bring out is if you have like a really chilled out kit that isn't like a really aggressive hard rock set, you might not want to compress the overheads or the toms. You might really just want to compress the kick and the snare. In general, things that have higher dynamic ranges are things I would tend to compress first and give priority. For example, a vocal, and also things like an acoustic guitar. These things should be compressed because of the fact that when an acoustic guitar is playing loud, it can definitely add a lot more volume than when it's playing quietly. Next thing, recording too hot or recording too loud. This could lead to a number of things, including a higher risk of clipping or distorting your audio on the way in to the signal itself, which you cannot fix. It will always be there. You will never fix it. You can only turn it down, but it's still going to be noticeable. And another thing you can do is you can bring up the noise floor of your overall mix. Essentially, you might listen to one incoming signal recorded by one microphone, and you might not hear a lot of background noise. But if you put that into a set where you have 40 microphones on it, all that accumulation of background noise is going to bring up what we call the noise floor. If you record too hot, that noise floor is going to exponentially grow over time if you do not record at proper levels. What are proper levels? It depends on what you're recording, but I say a safe bet is to try and come in at around negative 12 dB. Remember, you can always boost afterwards, but the noise floor is going to be harder to get rid of if you're recorded in a louder fashion. Okay, everyone on this channel loves microphones, so it would be wrong of me not to mention microphones. So if you're recording particularly with a condenser, microphone positioning in relation to the mouth or the sound source and in relation to the reflections of the room is a big part of recording. If you're recording in a reflective environment and in a square room, there's a couple things to keep in mind. I wouldn't put your singer in the middle of the room. That is a hot spot for room reflections. And I wouldn't put them in the corners either. The corners are a place where bass traps can occur. You can get a lot of low-end mud coming into the signal itself. It's nice to put them in an off-axis place, tangential or adjacent to the center of the room. There's a couple other things to keep in mind. And again, this is all primarily for condenser microphones more than anything. The space in between where you're recording from. In general, if you're recording with a condenser microphone, I would try and keep the singer around 8 to 11 inches away from the microphone itself, using the pop shield as a means to gauge distance between the microphone and the audio source, i.e. the vocal. But the problem with this method is if you have a really reflective room, being farther away from the microphone is going to bring out the room noise more because the audio source is going to be more from the room around it than if you were right up on the microphone. So you can actually kind of get rid of this effect by essentially getting closer to the microphone. It's called the proximity effect. You have to be careful when you do this. It's not the recommended way of getting around room reflections, but if you get closer to the microphone, you're going to get more bass response. It might sound a little bit warmer. You do need to be careful to sing at a lower volume though, in order to avoid clipping, or like we said in rule 3, just set the levels right. And number 5, most important rule in my opinion, don't always listen to the rules. I mean, recording is an art, just like the music itself is an art. You shouldn't necessarily treat everything like absolute fact. For example, one of my favorite engineers, Sylvia Massey, has recorded artists in a nuclear fuselage. She's recorded artists in a coal mine. These aren't places that necessarily have what could be considered the ideal sound, but it got the best out of the musicians in terms of their performance, and it offered its own unique characteristic of sound quality. There are certain things that are objective, like signal flow, unit transfer, things like that, but a lot of this is an art form, and you shouldn't treat it as absolute fact. Don't just trust everything you hear on the internet, as ironic as this sounds, coming from a guy on the internet, and know that there's no way to be like, here's what you do. Here is exactly how to record everything and it will sound great all the time. That doesn't exist. Experiment, get weird, listen and record as many things as you can so you can understand what sounds you prefer. Yeah, that's my rant. There is no definite rule to recording. It's an art form just like the music is an art form. And those are all my 5 things. If you liked it, please let me know. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.